Good evening, and welcome to Dream History. You can get comfortable now. Take one slow, calm breath and allow today to gently fade away. Now we can begin. We are entering ancient Greece. Not the Greece of names and speeches, not the Greece carved into white stone or arranged into lessons, but a quieter place, closer to the ground, where life is measured not by events, but by days that resemble one another so closely that they blend together, forming a continuous surface of ordinary time. It is early morning, not a moment of beginning, but of continuation, because life here does not restart each day, it resumes. Light reaches the stone first, spreading slowly across walls that have absorbed countless mornings before, warming uneven surfaces and narrow passages where the night still lingers, while shadows remain long and patient, retreating only when the sun insists. There is no sudden sound to mark the day's arrival, no signal, only small movements. A doorway opens part way, then fully, as someone steps outside with practiced ease, careful not to waste energy, careful not to disturb what does not need to be disturbed, because this morning, like most mornings, does not belong to excitement or anticipation. It belongs to necessity. Inside the houses, built from stone and mud brick, rooms remain dim, their interiors shaped more by function than comfort, with few openings for light and little separation between spaces, because walls are costly and space is always limited, and everything unnecessary has already been removed by time. The smell of ash and smoke from the previous evening still rests in the air, not unpleasant, simply present, woven into the fabric of life so completely that it no longer draws attention. People rise quietly, not because silence is required, but because nothing is gained by haste. The body knows what comes next. Hands reach for familiar tools, for containers worn smooth by years of use, for garments that have been repaired again and again, stitched carefully rather than replaced, because replacement is rare and repair is normal. Movement here is economical. Every step has been taken before. Courtyards, where they exist, begin to collect light, becoming the center of the household's activity, open to the sky and exposed to the slow warming of the day, while inside rooms remain cool and dark, offering brief refuge from the heat that will arrive soon enough. Water is prepared, grain is checked, small fires are tended, coaxed back to life rather than ignited anew, because even fire here is something continuous, something maintained rather than created. Outside, the street begins to fill, not with crowds, but with presence. Voices carry easily through narrow spaces, overlapping without intention, blending into a low, constant sound that will grow as the day advances, because privacy is scarce, and life unfolds largely in view of others, whether one wishes it or not. Stone beneath bare feet still holds the coolness of night, a sensation that will disappear as the sun climbs higher, replaced with warmth that settles into the body and does not leave until evening. Animals shift nearby. Tools are lifted and set down again. Smoke begins to rise from ovens and hearths, thin and pale in the morning light, drifting upward without urgency. This is not preparation for something special. This is preparation for repetition.
In ancient Greece, ordinary people do not wake asking what the day might bring, because the answer is already known, not in detail but in structure. Work waits. It always does. Some will move outward, beyond the clustered houses, toward fields that never offer certainty and must be worked carefully because the land is rocky and uneven, generous only in small portions, and every harvest depends on timing, weather, and restraint. Others remain closer, shaping clay, repairing tools, carrying loads for neighbors, or performing tasks that support those who leave, because labor here is shared unevenly but continuously, distributed according to role rather than choice. Women remain largely within the domestic sphere, though their work is no less constant, as food must be prepared again, water carried again, textiles produced again, and children guided into usefulness as soon as their bodies allow it, because childhood here is brief and contribution begins early. No one stands apart. Idleness is not a pause for reflection, it is a risk. Food is simple and familiar, repeating itself with little variation, built around bread that sustains the body, olives that preserve easily, small amounts of cheese, and vegetables when they are available, while meat remains rare, reserved for moments that stand slightly outside the ordinary flow. Eating does not interrupt the day, it fits into it. Meals are taken quickly, sometimes standing, sometimes seated briefly, often between tasks, because the purpose of food is not pleasure, but continuation, keeping the body moving through another cycle of work. Wine exists, but always diluted with water, consumed slowly without excess, because excess weakens the body, and weakness invites problems that cannot be easily solved. As the morning advances, the sun becomes more present, its warmth settling into stone and skin alike, and movement begins to adjust, because this world is shaped by heat as much as by habit. People rise early not because they value discipline, but because later hours are less forgiving, and the body, once overheated, cannot easily recover. Shade becomes valuable, rest becomes strategic. The day bends around the sun rather than opposing it. Within the city, sanitation is limited, managed as best as possible but never fully controlled, and water must be shared carefully, illness spreading easily through close quarters, injuries occurring often enough that they are expected rather than feared. These conditions are not debated, they are accepted. Life here is not organized around comfort, progress, or improvement, but around attention, the careful monitoring of resources, bodies, and time, because survival depends not on strength alone, but on restraint. As the noise of the day grows gradually, voices layering over one another, tools striking stone, clay, and wood in steady, unremarkable rhythms, the world of ordinary Greece settles fully into motion, not as a place of ideas or ideals, but as a living system carrying itself forward through another familiar day. And for now, there is nothing else it needs to do.
Take a slow breath and let it go gently. There is no need to hold your attention tightly because this world does not change quickly and it does not surprise. And the more you simply remain present, the more clearly its shape begins to appear. Not as a story of dramatic moments, but as a steady pattern of limits and adjustments that repeat so often they feel almost natural. In ancient Greece, the land is never far away, even when you are inside a town, even when you are between stone walls, because the land is the first condition of life here. and everything else, work, food, movement, even the size of a household, forms itself around what the ground can actually give. Much of the landscape is uneven, rocky, and broken into slopes, ridges, and narrow valleys, and because of that, wide fields like those in richer plains are rare, while small patches of cultivatable soil become valuable, not because they are beautiful, but because they are usable, and usefulness is what matters most when the day depends on what can be grown, stored, and carried through the seasons. The soil in many places is thin. It sits above stone, it dries quickly, and it does not hold water easily, which means that every year carries uncertainty, not as panic, not as constant fear, but as an underlying awareness that certain things cannot be forced, because the land will not respond to willpower, and the sun will not change its path for anyone. Summer arrives with a strong presence. Heat gathers early, presses down steadily, and lingers, turning midday into a slower part of the day, not by choice, but by physical necessity, because bodies can only work at full pace for so many hours before the sun begins to take more than it gives, and so routines form around this truth, rising early, moving steadily in the morning, and then narrowing activity when the air becomes heavy and bright. In winter, the shift is different. The cold is not always deep or endless, but it is enough to change movement, enough to make mornings sharper, evenings quicker, and indoor spaces more important. And when rain comes, it does not politely arrive as a light background sound. It can come in strong bursts, washing down slopes, turning paths into slick stone, and making travel slower. Because in a place where roads are simple and surfaces uneven, weather becomes a direct influence on time. Wind is also part of the daily world. It moves through gaps between buildings, along open hillsides, and across fields, drying sweat quickly in summer and cutting through thin clothing in cooler months. And people learn to read it, not as a romantic element of nature, but as a practical signal. How quickly water will evaporate, how soon the day will feel hotter, how easily a fire will take, and how quickly grain will dry after harvest. Because of these conditions, the choices of ordinary people remain narrow, and narrow choices create steady habits. Olive trees thrive in places where other crops struggle, and because of that, they become a quiet anchor, offering oil that can be stored, shared, and used slowly. And grapes also fit the landscape well, turning into wine that, when mixed with water, becomes a common part of daily consumption, not as celebration, but as routine. Grain remains essential because bread is reliable in a way that many foods are not, but grain cultivation is never effortless here, and where land is scarce, the work of maintaining productivity becomes part of the year itself, with fields used carefully, watched closely, and supported through methods that depend more on persistence than on abundance.
For the ordinary household, this means that food is never simply what you want. It is what is available. It is what can be stored. It is what will still exist in a few months. And so the kitchen, the storage jars, the baskets, and the careful portioning of supplies become a quiet form of planning, done without paperwork, without discussion, but through repeated practice, where the hands learn the measurement long before the mind names it. Water is another constant boundary. In some areas, it is carried from springs or public sources, and because carrying water is time and effort, water use becomes disciplined naturally, not as a moral lesson, but as a fact of weight and distance. And the daily movements of ordinary life include these repeated trips, the sound of containers being lifted and lowered, the careful balance of a load, the instinct to avoid spilling what cannot be easily replaced. All of this creates a certain emotional texture to the day, though it is not often expressed in words. It creates attentiveness. It creates the habit of watching. It creates patience that is not poetic, but practical, because impatience does not change the weather, and anger does not deepen the soil, and the most useful response to limitation is adjustment, not resistance. This is why the rhythm of ordinary Greek life feels steady, not because people are calm by nature, but because the world encourages calmness through repetition, by rewarding those who move within its boundaries and exhausting those who fight them. When someone walks out to a field early in the morning, or carries a tool toward a workshop, or lifts a basket of grain from storage, they are not simply beginning a task. They are participating in a system that has been shaped by land and climate over generations, and the system does not require belief or ideology to continue, because it continues through necessity. Even the layout of towns and villages reflect these conditions. Buildings cluster where water is accessible, where ground is stable enough to support walls, where slopes can be managed, and where fields lie close enough that daily travel does not consume too much energy, because energy, like grain, is a limited resource. And as the day moves forward, the sun climbs higher again, and the air begins to warm, and the stone begins to radiate heat back into the street, and you can sense why mornings matter so much here, why life begins early and narrows at midday, why shade feels precious without being spoken of, and why evening, when it comes, carries a particular softness, because it signals that the land, for a few hours, becomes easier to live within. And so, quietly, without any announcement, the ordinary world of Greece continues to shape ordinary people, not through grand events, but through the slow, constant pressure of sunlight, soil, water, and season, until the habits they create feel like the only possible way to live.
You may let your shoulders soften for a moment and allow the pace to remain slow. When we speak about cities in ancient Greece, it is important to set aside the image of wide streets, open squares filled with light, and carefully planned spaces meant to inspire, because for ordinary people, the city was not an idea or a symbol, but a dense physical environment that pressed inward, where life unfolded in narrow passages, crowded rooms, and constant proximity to other bodies. Most Greek cities grew gradually, not through careful design, but through accumulation, as houses were added where space allowed, paths formed where feet passed often enough, and neighborhoods thickened around water sources, markets, and walls, creating urban spaces that felt lived in rather than orderly, and intimate rather than spacious. Streets were often narrow, so narrow that two people carrying loads had to turn sideways to pass,
and so uneven that walking required attention, not because it was dangerous, but because stone, dirt, and debris shifted with weather and use, and rain could turn a familiar path into a slick surface that slowed movement and altered routines for the day. There was little separation between public and private life. Doors opened directly onto the street, and sounds moved freely between inside and outside, carrying voices, arguments, laughter, work, and fatigue, blending them into a constant background presence that never fully disappeared, even at night, because cities were never truly silent places. Water access shaped daily movement. Fountains, wells, and communal sources drew people repeatedly through the same routes, and because water had to be carried by hand, these trips became part of the city's rhythm, with the sound of containers knocking lightly against stone, footsteps echoing briefly in confined spaces, and brief exchanges of words that required no ceremony, because familiarity replaced formality in a place where faces were seen again and again. Sanitation was limited. Waste was managed simply, often removed from homes and streets by habit rather than infrastructure, and because of this, smells were not occasional intrusions, but part of the sensory landscape, especially in warm weather, when heat intensified everything the city contained, and people learned, without instruction, to tolerate what could not be avoided. Markets brought both relief and pressure. They were places of exchange, noise, and movement, where food could be obtained, tools repaired, and information absorbed without effort, but they also concentrated crowds, animals, and voices into tight spaces, making them energizing in the morning and exhausting by midday, especially when the sun rose high and shadows shortened. For ordinary residents, the city offered opportunity and constraint at the same time. Work was closer, trade more accessible, and skills more visible, but space was limited, privacy rare, and escape difficult, because walls enclosed the city, and movement beyond them often required purpose, time, and permission shaped by obligation rather than desire. Children grew up within this density. They learned to navigate tight spaces instinctively, to step aside, to carry small loads early, to recognize voices long before faces, and to accept constant social presence as normal, because solitude was not something most people experienced regularly, and being alone was often temporary rather than chosen. Animals were part of the urban world. Donkeys, goats, chickens, and dogs moved through streets and courtyards, contributing sounds and smells that blended into daily life, not as disruptions, but as expected elements of a working city, where humans and animals shared space without clear boundaries. Inside the city, time felt compressed, not because days were shorter, but because activity was layered, with many tasks happening within sight and sound of each other, creating a sense that life moved in overlapping currents, where one person's work was always visible to someone else, and privacy existed mostly behind closed doors and within accepted silence. Fire was a constant concern. Cooking, heating, and light all depended on flame, and in close quarters, a single mistake could affect many households, which encouraged careful habits, attentive movement,
and a quiet awareness of risk that shaped behavior without needing enforcement. Despite these conditions, or perhaps because of them, cities developed strong patterns of familiarity. Neighbors recognized one another's routines, noticed absences quickly, and shared information through observation rather than announcement, creating a form of social awareness that did not rely on formal structures, but on repetition and proximity. This closeness could feel supportive. It could also feel overwhelming. Arguments were heard, emotions were visible, personal struggles unfolded within earshot of others, and because of this, emotional restraint became a practical skill, not a moral ideal, as maintaining balance in a crowded environment required managing reactions as much as actions. Evenings brought subtle relief. As the sun lowered, heat softened, movement slowed, and the city exhaled slightly, not into silence, but into a quieter form of presence, where lamps replaced daylight, and voices dropped naturally, and the density that felt pressing during the day became, for a few hours, almost comforting. People returned indoors, or gathered in courtyards, or sat near doorways where air moved gently, and the closeness of the city shifted from strain to familiarity, from pressure to routine, because when movement decreased, the city felt smaller, and smaller spaces are easier to hold. In this way, the city shaped not only where people lived, but how they felt. It taught patience through crowding, awareness through proximity, and endurance through repetition, and it did so quietly, without instruction, simply by being what it was, day after day. And as night deepened, and the last sounds settled into the background, and the stone retained a little warmth from the sun, the ordinary city rested, not because it had changed, but because it would soon begin again, in exactly the same way.
Inside the ancient Greek city, the house is not designed to impress, to welcome, or to express identity, but to contain life efficiently, because for ordinary people, a house is first and foremost a shelter that holds routine, work, storage, and rest within a limited footprint, shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Most homes are modest in size. They are built from stone or mud brick, materials that are available locally and chosen for practicality, not appearance, and their walls are thick enough to offer some protection from heat and weather, but not enough to create silence, because sound moves easily through dense neighborhoods, and complete separation from the outside world is neither expected nor common. Windows are few, openings are small. Light enters indirectly, often from a central courtyard rather than from the street, and this design is intentional because it balances several needs at once: privacy from passers-by, control of heat, and protection from dust, noise, and unwanted attention, all of which are constant companions in the city. The courtyard becomes the heart of the house. It is open to the sky, allowing light and air to circulate, and around it daily life unfolds quietly, with food prepared, tools cleaned, clothing mended, and children supervised, not through formal instruction, but through presence, because everyone shares the same limited space, and learning happens by watching. Rooms are small and purposeful. There is no excess furniture. Surfaces are used for multiple tasks, and the same area may serve as workspace during the day and sleeping space at night, because space is too valuable to remain unused, and flexibility becomes an unspoken rule of domestic life. Floors are packed earth or stone. They are cool underfoot in summer and cold in winter, and people adapt by sitting, kneeling, and resting close to the ground, using mats, low stools, or folded cloths, rather than raised furniture, which would take up room and serve little additional function. Storage is constant and visible. Jars line walls. Baskets hang from hooks. Tools rest where they can be reached easily, and because homes are small, there is no separation between living space and working space, which means that domestic life is never idle, and even moments of rest occur within sight of what still needs to be done. Cooking is simple and contained. Small hearths or portable braziers provide heat for food, and smoke drifts upward and outward through openings rather than chimneys, settling lightly on walls and ceilings over time, marking the interior with a quiet record of repeated meals and seasons.
Privacy inside the household is limited. Rooms are divided by simple walls or curtains, and movement is visible, audible, and expected, especially in larger families where several generations share the same space and personal boundaries are learned not through isolation but through mutual adjustment. Women spend much of their time within these domestic spaces, not because the house is a place of rest, but because it is a center of labor, where grain is processed, cloth is woven, food is stored, and daily order is maintained, and these activities require consistency rather than visibility, patience rather than recognition. Children grow up within this rhythm. They learn the shape of the house early, understand where objects belong, where movement is allowed, and where quiet is expected. And because space is shared, their presence is constant, their learning gradual, and their responsibilities introduced early without ceremony. The house also serves as protection from the outside world. Its inward-facing design creates a buffer between the family and the street, allowing ordinary people to retreat from noise, heat, and social exposure, even if only partially. And this partial retreat is enough to restore balance at the end of a long day. At night, the house changes again. Light becomes limited. Lamps cast soft, uneven shadows. Movement slows naturally because darkness narrows vision and encourages stillness, and sleeping arrangements form quickly, with family members resting close together, sharing warmth, space, and familiarity. There is no expectation of solitude. Sleep is communal, breathing overlaps, and the sounds of the city, though muted, continue in the background, reminding those inside that the world does not disappear when the door closes. It simply moves a little farther away. In this way, the Greek house shapes emotional life as much as physical life. It encourages awareness of others. It reduces excess. It teaches adaptation through repetition, and it does so quietly, without instruction, simply by being small, shared, and functional. And as the lamps dim and the courtyard settles into shadow, and the last tasks of the day are completed without urgency, the house holds its inhabitants gently, not as a refuge from life, but as the place where life is gathered, contained, and allowed to rest. You may take another slow breath and allow the rhythm to stretch gently. Inside the ordinary Greek household, life is not organized around individual preference, personal expression, or emotional fulfillment, but around a clear and deeply rooted structure that determines who speaks, who decides, who works, and who waits. And this structure is so familiar to those living within it that it rarely feels like a rule, because it has always been there, shaping daily behavior long before anyone learns to question it. The household is patriarchal. At its center stands the adult male head of the family, whose authority is not expressed through constant command or visible dominance, but through assumed responsibility for property, labor, and public interaction, because the outside world, markets, contracts, disputes, obligations, moves primarily through him, making his position less a privilege and more a burden that must be carried consistently. Around a central figure, the household arranges itself naturally. Women occupy the inner spaces of domestic life, managing food preparation, textile production, storage, and the continuous maintenance of order, not as a single task, but as an unbroken sequence of small actions that begin early and end late. And because these actions repeat daily, they form the stable background against which all other activity takes place. Children exist within this structure from the moment they are old enough to observe. They are not shielded from work or responsibility, but slowly absorbed into it, learning through imitation rather than instruction, watching hands move, tools used, grain measured, cloth repaired, and gradually being given small roles that expand with age, because usefulness defines belonging more than affection ever could. Age matters, not as a number, but as accumulated experience, because elders remain part of the working household for as long as their bodies allow, contributing advice, memory, and supervision. And even when their physical strength fades, their presence continues to influence decisions, reinforcing continuity across generations, rather than separating life into stages. Marriage is practical. It is arranged to strengthen households, secure labor, and ensure stability, not to fulfill personal desire, and women typically enter their husband's household, adapting to new rhythms, expectations, and hierarchies, learning quickly where they fit within a system that does not pause to accommodate uncertainty. Emotional life exists, but it is rarely centered. Affection is expressed through reliability rather than words, through presence rather than intimacy, because survival depends less on how people feel and more on whether tasks are completed, food prepared, and resources preserved. Social order extends beyond the house. Status is visible in subtle ways, through clothing quality, household size, the presence of slaves, or access to land. But these differences are accepted as part of the natural arrangement of the world, not constantly challenged, because stability depends on predictability, and predictability depends on people remaining within their assigned roles. Slaves are woven into this structure seamlessly. They are present in many households, performing labor that supports daily function, often without recognition, and their existence is treated as normal rather than exceptional, making inequality an ordinary feature of life rather than a moral dilemma openly discussed. Women's movement outside the house is limited, not because they are physically confined at all times, but because social expectation narrows acceptable behavior, encouraging discretion, restraint, and invisibility.
And these expectations are reinforced not through force, but through repetition, habit, and the quiet pressure of reputation. Children grow into these roles gradually. Boys are prepared for public life, trade, or farming. Girls are prepared for domestic responsibility. And because this division is reinforced daily, it becomes internalized early, shaping identity before alternatives can even be imagined. What holds this system together is not fear alone, it is familiarity. It is the comfort of knowing what is expected. It is the relief of not having to decide everything anew each day, because decisions have already been made by tradition, custom, and necessity. Conflict exists, of course. Arguments happen, tension builds, but open disruption is rare because the cost of breaking structure is high. And for ordinary people, maintaining order within the household is one of the few ways to ensure stability in a world already full of uncertainty. As the day unfolds and each person moves through their assigned tasks without comment, the household operates like a living mechanism, not cold, not mechanical, but coordinated, where every role supports another, and where the absence of any single part is felt immediately. And when evening approaches and work slows and bodies grow tired, the structure does not disappear, it simply softens. Authority becomes quieter, movement becomes slower, and the household, having carried its members through another ordinary day, settles back into itself, ready to repeat the same pattern again, tomorrow and the day after that, and for generations beyond memory.
In the life of an ordinary person in ancient Greece, a day does not begin with intention or ambition, but with light, because light is the first signal that movement is required. And when the sky begins to pale and the air shifts from cool to gently warm, bodies respond almost automatically, rising not because they wish to, but because this is the hour when work can be done before heat, noise, and fatigue narrow the available time. Morning is quiet, but not still. Doors open softly, footsteps cross courtyards, water is fetched while the air is still manageable, carried in containers that feel heavier than they look, and these repeated trips form one of the first rhythms of the day, because without water there can be no cooking, no cleaning, no work, and so this task, though simple, holds quiet importance. Food in the morning is minimal. Bread, perhaps dipped in something simple, sometimes accompanied by olives or a small portion of cheese, eaten without ceremony, without conversation, because nourishment is functional at this hour, and the body requires energy more than pleasure. Soon after, work begins. For farmers, this means moving toward fields beyond the city walls, tools carried by hand, pace steady rather than rushed, because endurance matters more than speed, and mistakes made early in the day can echo through hours of labor. For craftsmen, work begins closer to home. Shops open toward the street, tools are arranged where light falls best, hands return to familiar motions, shaping clay, cutting wood, lifting stone, repeating movements learned long ago, not through instruction, but through years of observation and correction. As the sun climbs, activity adjusts, movement slows, shade becomes valuable, bodies respond to heat by narrowing effort rather than resisting it, because resistance wastes energy, and energy is something that must be conserved carefully, especially in summer when the sun presses down without apology. Midday is not a break in the modern sense. It is a reduction. Tasks that can wait do so. People remain near walls, under awnings, inside courtyards where air circulates slightly better, and food is eaten again, often cold, often simple, because cooking adds heat and appetite fades when the body focuses on cooling itself. Children remain present throughout this cycle. They carry small loads, they watch, they are sent on errands that build familiarity with streets, faces, and expectations, learning early how the city and household function, because there is no clear boundary between childhood and responsibility, only a gradual increase in usefulness. In the afternoon, work resumes cautiously, shadows lengthen, the air begins to ease, tasks that were postponed return, and people move again with slightly more freedom, completing what remains necessary before darkness approaches, because darkness limits visibility, and limited visibility increases risk in a world without artificial light. As evening arrives, the pace shifts again. Animals are fed, tools are cleaned and set aside, water is fetched once more, anticipating night needs, and small domestic tasks fill the final light of the day, not as burdens, but as closure, because leaving work unfinished invites difficulty tomorrow. The evening meal is modest, bread again, perhaps vegetables, perhaps something warm if fuel allows. Conversation is minimal, not because people are distant, but because fatigue shapes attention inward, and after a full day of physical effort, silence becomes a form of rest rather than absence. Lamps are lit carefully. Light is precious. It is used sparingly, illuminating only what must be seen, and shadows fill the rest of the space without resistance, because darkness is expected, not feared. As night deepens, the city and the household quiet together. Sounds soften, movement slows, sleep comes early, not through ritual, but through exhaustion, as bodies yield naturally when effort has been sustained long enough. There is no sense of completion, no reflection on accomplishment. The day ends not with satisfaction or disappointment, but with simple cessation, because tomorrow will require the same pattern, and there is little advantage in judging what will repeat regardless. In this way, the typical day does not stand out. It does not define a life through milestones or memories. Instead, it becomes part of a long sequence of similar days, where meaning accumulates not through difference, but through persistence, and where survival depends less on extraordinary action than on the quiet discipline of returning, again and again, to the same rhythm. From dawn to heat to evening to rest. In ancient Greece, food is not a celebration, not an expression of identity, and not a source of daily pleasure, but a carefully managed resource whose primary purpose is to keep the body working long enough to reach the next day. And because of this, eating is approached with practicality rather than anticipation, shaped by availability, storage, and habit more than by taste or variety. For most ordinary people, the foundation of every meal is grain,
grain that has been grown on limited land, harvested with effort, stored with care, and measured cautiously, because once grain is gone, there is no easy replacement, and hunger does not arrive suddenly or dramatically, but slowly, through smaller portions, thinner bread, and longer gaps between meals. Bread is everywhere, not soft, not refined, and not abundant, but dense, coarse, and filling, baked in simple ovens or on heated surfaces, eaten plain or dipped lightly into oil when oil is available, and because bread requires time, fuel, and preparation, it becomes the most reliable way to convert effort into nourishment. Alongside olives appear again and again. They grow where other crops struggle, they store well, and when pressed into oil, they offer something even more valuable than calories: flexibility, because oil can be used for cooking, preserving, lighting, and basic care of the body, making it one of the most important substances in the ordinary Greek household, even when used sparingly. Wine exists, but not as indulgence. It is diluted with water almost without exception, not only to make it last longer, but because undiluted wine is considered excessive and impractical. And in a world where moderation is enforced by necessity rather than morality, dilution becomes habit rather than choice. Vegetables supplement the diet when available. Greens, onions, legumes, and whatever can be grown locally or gathered nearby add variety in form more than in flavor. And because seasons control availability, people do not expect consistency, learning instead to adapt their meals to what the land provides at that moment. Meat is rare, not forbidden, not unknown, but infrequent, appearing mostly during festivals, sacrifices, or specific moments of abundance, because raising animals for meat requires resources that most households cannot afford to lose regularly, and so animals are valued more for what they produce over time: milk, labor, offspring, than for what they offer once. Cheese fills some of this gap. It preserves milk beyond its short natural life, concentrates nourishment, and travels easily, making it a practical companion to bread, especially for those whose work takes them away from home during the day. Hunger is not constant, but it is familiar. It exists at the edge of awareness, shaping behavior quietly, encouraging restraint, discouraging waste, and teaching households to think in terms of days and seasons rather than moments, because survival depends not on eating well today, but on eating enough over time. Meals are shared, not as social events, but as efficient gatherings, where food is distributed simply, eaten quickly, and finished without ceremony, because daylight is valuable, fuel is limited, and work resumes as soon as the body allows. Children learn this relationship with food early. They learn to eat what is given without expectation of choice, to recognize scarcity without panic, and to understand fullness not as abundance, but as sufficiency, because indulgence teaches nothing useful in a world where balance keeps people alive. Food storage is constant work. Jars are sealed, grain is checked, oil is guarded, and because storage failure can mean loss of months of labor, these tasks carry quiet importance, performed carefully and repeatedly, without acknowledgement, because success is invisible and failure is not. Even the act of cooking reflects this restraint. Heat is managed, fuel is conserved, Recipes are simple, repetitive, and reliable because experimentation risks waste, and waste invites hunger, which is never abstract when the next harvest is uncertain. Emotion rarely attaches itself to meals. There is no disappointment when food is plain, because plain is expected, and there is no excitement when food improves slightly, because improvement is temporary, and attaching joy to it only sharpens its absence later. In this way, food teaches a specific emotional discipline. It teaches acceptance. It teaches patience. It teaches the ability to continue working even when desire is unmet, because the body learns to function within limits, and the mind follows. As the day moves forward and another simple meal is eaten without comment, without excess, and without complaint, food disappears back into the background of life, where it belongs in an ordinary world, supporting action without drawing attention to itself. And when night comes and hunger nests quietly for a few hours, held at bay by bread, oil, and habit, the household settles again, not satisfied, not deprived, but balanced carefully between effort and survival, ready to begin the same calculation again tomorrow.
In ancient Greece, work is not a phase of life, not a temporary effort leading toward rest or reward, but the permanent condition of existence. Because for ordinary people, every day requires physical contribution simply to maintain balance with the world around them. And without that contribution, even briefly, life begins to narrow in ways that cannot be ignored. Labor fills the hours between dawn and darkness. It appears in many forms: farming, building, carrying, shaping, repairing. But its underlying character remains the same, because it demands the body again and again, not through sudden exertion, but through steady, repetitive movement that accumulates fatigue slowly, almost invisibly, until rest becomes necessary rather than desired. For farmers, work begins beyond the city walls. They move into fields shaped by stone boundaries and uneven soil, guiding simple tools through ground that resists improvement, knowing that effort does not guarantee success, but that lack of effort guarantees failure, and so they persist, adjusting pace rather than intention, because survival depends on consistency more than strength. For craftsmen, labor takes place closer to home. Hands repeat practiced motions in workshops open to the street, where light falls unevenly and sound carries freely, and where skill develops not through creativity, but through endurance, as the same task is performed until the body memorizes it so completely that thought becomes unnecessary. Stone is lifted, clay is shaped, wood is smoothed, rope and canvas are pulled. Each action is learned early, refined slowly, and maintained through repetition, because tools are simple, materials unforgiving, and mistakes costly in time and energy. Slaves perform much of this work. They appear everywhere, in homes, workshops, fields, and streets, moving through tasks without pause. And because their labor is constant and expected, it becomes nearly invisible to those who depend on it, woven so tightly into daily function that life without it is rarely imagined. Even free citizens work physically. Status does not remove the need for effort, it only alters its form slightly, because comfort is limited, assistance scarce, and the environment demands participation, regardless of social position. Work continues through discomfort. Heat burns skin, dust settles in lungs, muscles ache, hands crack and harden, and yet movement continues,
not because people are indifferent to pain, but because stopping creates greater risk than continuing, and the body adapts gradually, building tolerance rather than relief. There is little separation between work and life. Tasks overlap. Domestic labor blends into economic labor. Repair happens alongside production. Children assist. Elders supervise. And because everything takes place within shared space, labor becomes social by default, visible, audible, and quietly regulated by habit rather than command. Time is not measured precisely. There are no clocks guiding effort. Instead, shadows, temperature, and fatigue determine pace, and work expands or contracts accordingly, because forcing productivity beyond physical limit leads only to injury, which is far more dangerous than delay. Rest exists, but it is brief. It appears in shade, in moments of stillness, in pauses between tasks, and it carries no ceremony, because rest is not leisure but recovery, a necessary adjustment that allows labor to resume. There is little expectation of change. Work does not promise advancement. It does not build toward a different future. It sustains the present. And this understanding shapes attitude, because hope is placed not in transformation, but in continuity, in the quiet expectation that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough that preparation remains useful. As the sun lowers, labor narrows again. Bodies slow. Tasks conclude where they must. Tools are set aside, not because work is finished, but because light is fading, and without light, risk increases, making restraint the wiser choice. The body carries the weight of the day inward. Muscles remain tense. Hands remember pressure. Breathing deepens. And as people return toward home, workshop, or courtyard, labor does not disappear, but loosens its grip slightly, allowing fatigue to settle without resistance. In this way, work defines life not through achievement, but through endurance, shaping bodies, habits, and expectations over time, until effort becomes the background condition of existence, and rest, when it arrives, feels not like reward, but like permission to continue again tomorrow. In the ordinary life of ancient Greece, slavery is not a separate system operating at the edges of society, nor a rare condition encountered only in certain places, but a constant embedded presence that supports nearly every aspect of daily existence, so thoroughly integrated that most people do not speak about it, question it, or even consciously notice it, because life has always functioned this way, and imagining an alternative would require rethinking the entire structure of work, household order, and economic survival. Slaves are everywhere. They move through homes, workshops, farms, and streets, performing tasks that allow the visible routines of free people to continue uninterrupted. And because their labor is continuous and expected, it fades into the background of perception, becoming part of the environment rather than an active subject of attention. In the household, slaves grind grain, carry water, prepare food, clean spaces, watch children, and maintain order, often rising earlier and resting later than anyone else, because their time is not their own, and the rhythm of their day is shaped entirely by the needs of others, rather than by light, heat, or personal endurance. In workshops, slaves operate tools, lift materials, and repeat skilled motions under supervision, producing goods that support both household income and city life. And because their labor reduces cost and increases output, it becomes economically necessary in a system where margins are thin and survival depends on efficiency. In agriculture, slaves work fields alongside free laborers, performing the same physical tasks under the same sun, yet carrying a different weight, because while hardship affects everyone, only some have the possibility of rest that is freely chosen rather than granted. For ordinary citizens, slavery shapes daily life indirectly. It determines how much time a household head can spend outside the home, how much labor a family must perform themselves, and how food, water, and materials are distributed, creating layers of dependency that feel natural only because they are stable and long-standing. This stability dulls moral reflection. Slavery is treated as a fact of life rather than a condition requiring justification, discussed only in terms of management, discipline, or value, and not as a question of right or wrong, because ordinary people are focused on maintaining their own survival within the system, not on dismantling the structures that support it. Slaves come from many places. Some are captured in war. Some are born into slavery. Some are sold through networks that extend beyond the city-state, making slavery not only a domestic reality, but part of a wider economic web that connects distant regions through human labor. Within households, relationships between slaves and free people vary. Some interactions are harsh. Some are distant. Some become familiar over time, shaped by daily proximity rather than affection, because shared space creates routine contact even when power remains unequal, and this familiarity can soften behavior without changing structure. Punishment exists as a constant possibility. Discipline is expected. Obedience is enforced, and while extreme cruelty is not always visible, the underlying imbalance of power remains unquestioned, shaping posture, tone, and movement, because slaves must always remain aware of their position within the household hierarchy. For women of the household, slaves often enable domestic order. They share labor. They extend capacity. And this reliance further normalizes inequality, embedding it into the most intimate spaces of daily life, where necessity overrides reflection. Children grow up observing this arrangement. They learn early who gives commands and who receives them, who rests and who continues working, and because this learning occurs without explanation, it becomes internalized as normal rather than learned as ideology. In public spaces, slaves move through crowds, carrying loads, accompanying their owners, or performing tasks that support trade and transport. And because they are so numerous, they blend into the movement of the city, recognized individually only when their presence interrupts routine. Freedom and unfreedom exist side by side. They are visible, audible, and intertwined, yet rarely discussed openly, because stability depends on acceptance, and acceptance depends on silence, especially among those who benefit from the system without possessing power themselves. As the day ends, slaves do not fully leave work behind. Their tasks simply change form. They prepare evening meals. They clean. They remain alert. And while free people rest, slaves wait, ready to respond, because waiting itself is part of their labor. In this way, slavery underpins ordinary Greek life quietly and continuously, not as a dramatic institution, but as a constant condition, shaping the flow of work, the structure of households, and the rhythm of the city itself. And when night finally settles, and lamps flicker softly, and bodies grow still, slavery does not disappear into darkness. It remains present, silent, and necessary, holding the ordinary world together so that it may repeat itself once again. In the ordinary world of ancient Greece, the lives of most women unfold not across streets, markets, or public assemblies, but within the interior spaces of the household, where walls, courtyards, and routines create a contained environment that defines responsibility, movement, and expectation so completely that stepping beyond it often feels unnecessary rather than forbidden. This inward orientation is not always enforced by force. It is shaped by custom, reputation, and repetition, because a woman's presence inside the home is understood as proper, reliable, and safe, while visibility outside carries social weight that few households wish to manage, and so daily life narrows naturally toward the domestic sphere, not through constant restriction, but through habit reinforced over time. Within the house, women's labor is continuous. It does not begin at a specific hour, and it does not end cleanly, because tasks overlap and return endlessly: grinding grain, preparing food, spinning thread, weaving cloth, washing, cleaning, managing storage, supervising children, coordinating slaves, forming a dense web of activity that sustains the household without drawing attention to itself. Textile production alone consumes enormous time. Spinning fibers into thread, maintaining tension, repairing breaks, and weaving cloth requires patience and precision, and because clothing must be replaced, repaired, and adapted constantly, this work becomes one of the most persistent demands on women's time, performed while seated, standing, or walking between tasks, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of the day. Movement within the house follows quiet rules. Certain spaces belong more fully to women, others to men, and while these boundaries are not always marked physically, they are understood socially, guiding where people sit, where they work, and how they move through shared rooms, creating an internal order that mirrors the larger structure of society. Women manage storage carefully. They track grain, oil, and household supplies through memory rather than record, understanding consumption rates intuitively, adjusting portions subtly as seasons change, because miscalculation risks hunger later, and hunger affects everyone. Children remain close. They are fed, watched, corrected, and guided without pause, learning household rhythms through proximity rather than instruction. And because mothers and female relatives are constantly present, emotional bonds form quietly, without ceremony, reinforced by shared time rather than deliberate expression.
Public life remains distant. Women rarely attend assemblies. They seldom participate directly in trade. Their knowledge of the city comes through sound, second-hand information, and brief encounters rather than sustained presence. And this distance shapes perception, narrowing awareness not out of ignorance, but out of practical focus on what lies within reach. Marriage strengthens this containment. Women move from one household to another, adapting to new hierarchies and expectations, learning quickly how to align their labor with unfamiliar rhythms,
because harmony within the home determines security, and conflict carries risks that few can afford. Despite this limitation, women's influence is real. They shape daily outcomes through organization, persistence, and quiet authority over domestic processes, ensuring that food appears, clothing endures, and children survive, even though their contribution rarely receives recognition beyond the household itself. Emotional expression is restrained, fatigue is accepted. Satisfaction comes from continuity rather than achievement, because success is measured not by visibility, but by absence of crisis. No shortage, no disorder, no disruption. As evening approaches, women's work shifts rather than stops. Meals are prepared, spaces are reset, supplies are checked, and when darkness deepens, rest comes gradually, often while seated, while hands still move, repairing cloth or preparing tomorrow's needs, because stopping completely feels unnatural in a life shaped by constant care. In this way, women's lives form the hidden structure of ordinary Greek existence, supporting stability without demanding acknowledgement, shaping survival through consistency rather than command. And as the household settles for the night, and the city quiets beyond the walls, women remain present within the rhythm, not visible, not celebrated, but essential, holding the ordinary world together through patience, repetition, and unbroken responsibility. In the ordinary life of ancient Greece, clothing is not a statement, not an expression of status chosen freely each morning, and not a changing reflection of personal taste, but a practical layer placed between the body and the environment, designed to protect skin from sun, dust, wind, and abrasion, and to endure repeated use rather than invite attention. Most garments are simple. Tunics made from coarse fabric hang straight from the shoulders, secured with pins or belts, and because fabric is valuable, cuts are minimal, waste is avoided, and decoration remains rare, especially among ordinary people whose concern lies not in appearance, but in durability and reuse. Materials matter deeply. Wool is common because sheep adapt well to the landscape, and wool insulates even when worn thin, while linen appears less frequently, requiring more resources and effort, and silk, though known, remains distant and irrelevant to daily life for most people, existing only as rumor or luxury beyond reach. Clothing is layered, not for style but for adjustment, because temperature shifts across the day, and garments must respond to cool mornings, intense midday heat, and softer evenings, allowing the body to regulate itself without constant replacement or change. Repair is constant. Tears are stitched, edges are reinforced, fabric is patched again and again until the original shape disappears beneath evidence of use. And because replacing clothing requires time, skill, and material, maintenance becomes a routine task performed quietly during moments that might otherwise be considered rest. Footwear is minimal. Sandals offer some protection from stone and heat, but many walk barefoot, especially within the home, because leather wears quickly, and saving footwear for longer journeys becomes a sensible habit rather than a sign of poverty. The body itself bears marks of this material reality. Skin darkens from sun, hands harden, feet thicken, and these changes are not hidden because the culture does not demand concealment of labor's effects, treating the working body as normal rather than flawed. Children wear simplified versions of adult garments. They outgrow clothing quickly, and adjustments are made as needed because fabric moves through the household, passing from older to younger, reshaped and reused until it can no longer serve its purpose. Cleanliness exists within limits. Clothing is washed, but not frequently, because water, effort, and time constrain routine washing, and garments are aired, shaken, and repaired far more often than they are cleaned, reinforcing a relationship with material that values preservation over renewal. There is little sense of fashion changing rapidly. Styles remain stable over long periods because innovation offers no advantage in a world where function outweighs novelty, and standing out visually may attract attention that carries social cost rather than benefit. Social differences appear subtly. Finer fabric, cleaner lines, better maintained garments. But these differences are understated because excessive display contradicts the practical tone of ordinary life, where survival depends more on blending in than standing apart. Clothing also reflects labor, loose enough to move, secure enough to stay in place, adapted to tasks that require bending, lifting, and carrying, allowing the body to work without constant adjustment, because distraction slows productivity and distraction costs energy. As the day moves forward, garments absorb heat, sweat, dust, and motion, becoming heavier, less flexible, and more uncomfortable, and yet they remain worn without complaint, because removing them offers no advantage in public spaces, and endurance becomes part of daily discipline. At night, clothing is set aside carefully, folded, placed within reach, prepared for reuse tomorrow, because tomorrow will not require something new, only something that still works. In this way, clothing shapes daily experience quietly, reminding the body of its limits and environment through constant contact, teaching restraint, adaptation, and care through repetition rather than instruction. And as sleep arrives and fabric settles against tired skin, clothing becomes less noticeable again, not as absence, but as a familiar presence, worn thin by use and ready to serve once more with the return of light. Illness appears often and without ceremony, moving through households and neighborhoods as bodies weaken from exhaustion, poor nutrition, untreated wounds, or seasonal change. And because understanding of disease remains limited, symptoms are interpreted practically rather than theoretically as signals that work must slow, rest must increase, or help must be requested, not as mysteries to be solved, but as obstacles to be endured. Minor injuries are common because tools are sharp, surfaces uneven, and labor continuous, and a small cut, blister, or strain can become serious if infection sets in, making care a matter of observation rather than treatment, where wounds are cleaned, wrapped, and watched closely, not because recovery is guaranteed, but because neglect increases risk. Medical knowledge exists, but it is uneven and limited, relying on simple herbal remedies, basic procedures and accumulated experience rather than systematic understanding. And healers, when consulted, offer what they can through mixtures of plants, oils, and ritual actions that aim more to support the body's own endurance than to cure decisively. Pain is accepted as part of life rather than treated as an emergency because constant physical work makes discomfort unavoidable, and ordinary people learn to distinguish between pain that can be worked through and pain that demands rest, developing an internal scale of tolerance shaped by necessity rather than choice. Children are especially vulnerable, and many do not survive early years, a fact understood quietly and rarely spoken aloud, because grief is common enough to become private, managed within families rather than shared publicly, and because dwelling on loss does not change the conditions that produce it. Women face particular risks related to childbirth, which remains a dangerous moment in life rather than a controlled event, approached with preparation and communal support, but without certainty. And survival through these moments reinforces caution, patience, and respect for the limits of the body. Epidemics move through cities more easily than through countryside because density, limited sanitation, and constant contact create conditions where illness spreads quickly. And when this happens, daily routines adapt subtly, not through organized response, but through avoidance, reduced movement, and quiet observation. Death is present, but not dramatic, appearing as a natural conclusion rather than a rupture, integrated into daily awareness without constant mourning, because when life expectancy is uncertain, continuity matters more than expectation, and attention remains focused on sustaining those who remain. Burial practices are simple for ordinary people, emphasizing closure rather than commemoration, and memory survives through family continuity rather than monuments, reinforcing the idea that life's value lies in persistence rather than recognition. In this environment, health is not a goal, but a temporary condition that allows work to continue, and illness is not an injustice, but a disruption to be managed carefully, because survival depends not on eliminating vulnerability, but on navigating it calmly and repeatedly. And as the day moves on, and bodies continue to work despite stiffness, soreness, or fatigue, health remains present not as comfort, but as function, quietly supporting another cycle of effort, another shared meal, another return to rest, until the fragile balance holds just long enough to begin again tomorrow. Religion in the daily life of ordinary people in ancient Greece unfolds not as grand myth, heroic narrative, or constant emotional devotion, but as a quiet, repetitive layer woven into routine actions that rarely interrupt work or demand deep reflection, because belief here functions less as explanation of the universe and more as a practical system for maintaining order, continuity, and a sense of protection within a world that feels uncertain, physically demanding, and only partially controllable. For most households, religious practice begins and ends at home, where small shrines, simple offerings, and habitual gestures mark the passing of days without spectacle, as libations of diluted wine, bits of food, or brief spoken words acknowledge forces believed to influence health, harvest, family stability, and luck, not because these actions guarantee results, but because repeating them feels safer than neglecting them. There is no sharp separation between sacred and ordinary space, because altars stand near doorways, hearths, or courtyards, blending seamlessly into domestic life, and religion becomes something done alongside cooking, cleaning, and resting, rather than something that replaces them or elevates daily existence into ceremony. Public temples exist, but for most people they are visited infrequently, often tied to specific festivals or communal events rather than daily worship, and even then participation is structured, brief, and restrained, with attention focused on correct behavior rather than emotional experience, because order matters more than belief intensity. Gods are understood less as personal companions and more as distant powers associated with locations, functions, or conditions, invoked for protection, fertility, or success, but rarely expected to intervene dramatically. And when outcomes are poor, disappointment does not usually become rebellion or doubt, but acceptance that effort and fate do not always align. Religion also provides a framework for explaining misfortune without assigning blame within the community, allowing illness, crop failure, or death to be understood as part of a larger balance rather than personal failure, which helps preserve social cohesion in environments where stress and loss are common.
Ritual calendars mark certain days as distinct, yet these moments punctuate rather than transform life, offering brief pauses of gathering, food sharing, and observance before work resumes, reinforcing continuity rather than escape. Priests are present but not dominant in daily life, and religious authority does not overshadow household authority because most decisions remain practical, guided by necessity rather than doctrine, and belief adapts to routine rather than shaping it completely. Children learn religion through observation rather than instruction, absorbing gestures, phrases, and habits without formal explanation, which allows belief to persist quietly across generations without requiring deep understanding or emotional attachment. In this way, religion becomes a stabilizing background presence, offering reassurance without demanding focus, structure without excess, and meaning without disruption, fitting naturally into lives already shaped by labor, repetition, and endurance. As evening approaches and lamps are lit, a final offering or whispered acknowledgement may be made almost absent-mindedly, not as a moment of devotion, but as a habit inherited and maintained before the household settles again into sleep, carrying belief forward simply by continuing to live as those before them did.
Illness in ancient Greece exists not as an occasional disruption, but as a constant background risk woven into everyday life, because crowded living conditions, limited sanitation, physical labor, and exposure to heat, cold, and injury mean that the human body is always vulnerable, and people live with the quiet understanding that health is temporary, uncertain, and never fully protected. Minor injuries that modern life would dismiss easily, small cuts, infections, twisted joints, persistent fevers, often become serious threats because wounds heal slowly, bacteria spread unnoticed, and medical intervention remains limited, relying on basic herbal remedies, rest, and experience rather than systematic knowledge or reliable treatment. Healers exist, but their reach is inconsistent, and their methods combine observation, tradition, and belief, offering comfort and occasional relief rather than guaranteed recovery, which means families learn to manage sickness internally, adjusting workloads, sharing tasks, and accepting reduced productivity as part of life rather than as a crisis demanding solutions. Disease moves easily through dense neighborhoods, carried by water, waste, insects, and proximity, and outbreaks are neither rare nor surprising, so sickness becomes normalized, spoken of quietly, endured patiently, and rarely dramatized, because fear offers no advantage when illness cannot be easily avoided. Children are especially vulnerable, and early mortality is common enough that families grow accustomed to loss without becoming indifferent, developing emotional restraint that allows daily life to continue even when grief remains present, because survival depends on maintaining routine rather than collapsing under sorrow.
Death itself is familiar, not hidden or postponed, occurring within homes rather than distant institutions, and bodies are prepared by family members, rituals performed simply and efficiently, without elaborate display, reflecting both limited resources and an understanding that death is part of the expected cycle rather than a rupture of meaning. Burial practices vary by region and status, but for ordinary people they remain modest, focused on respect rather than legacy, with few possessions accompanying the dead, reinforcing the idea that life is lived primarily in the present, with little expectation of lasting remembrance beyond family memory. Older people carry visible marks of physical strain, worn joints, reduced strength, chronic pain, yet they remain integrated into household life as long as possible, contributing through supervision, storytelling, and experience rather than physical labor, because complete withdrawal from work is rarely possible or culturally supported. Fear of death does not dominate thought, because constant exposure reduces its emotional intensity, and people focus instead on managing the present day, conserving strength, and preparing for predictable challenges, rather than imagining distant futures. As night falls and households settle into quiet rest, illness, injury, and mortality remain unspoken but understood realities, shaping behavior subtly through caution, moderation, and acceptance, reinforcing a worldview where endurance matters more than hope, and survival is measured not in years lived, but in days successfully repeated. As another day closes in ancient Greece, there is no sense of completion, no dramatic ending, no feeling that something has been achieved or resolved, because life here is not structured around progress, transformation, or personal fulfillment, but around continuation, where the highest success is simply that the household remains intact, the food lasts, the body holds, and tomorrow can be met with the same familiar motions as today. Generations pass through the same narrow streets, the same courtyards, the same fields beyond the city walls, performing nearly identical tasks under the same sun, shaped by the same limits of land, climate, and social order, so that time feels less like a line moving forward and more like a circle that tightens slightly with each repetition, but never truly changes direction. Children grow into the labor they have always observed,
not because choice is denied explicitly, but because alternatives are rarely visible, and expectation, habit, and necessity quietly align, turning inherited routines into accepted reality long before questioning could form. Adults measure their lives not by ambition or legacy, but by reliability, by whether they fulfill their roles within the household, maintain order, and avoid becoming a burden. Because in a world with limited safety nets, stability is the closest thing to security that ordinary people can achieve. Old age, when it arrives, brings neither honor nor comfort guaranteed by status, but a gradual narrowing of physical ability, accompanied by continued presence within the family, where memory replaces strength and experience substitutes for speed, reinforcing the idea that usefulness does not end abruptly, but fades slowly, as long as life allows. There is little expectation that the future will improve conditions, because history does not present itself as a story of upward movement, and most people do not imagine their children living fundamentally different lives, only hoping they might endure with slightly less hunger, slightly fewer losses, or slightly better fortune within the same narrow frame. Religion, tradition, and social norms all support this acceptance, not by promising salvation or transformation, but by reinforcing order, repetition, and continuity, reminding people that what matters is not escape from the system, but correct participation within it. Night settles over stone and earth. Lamps dim, voices soften, and households draw inward, bodies resting close together in shared spaces that offer warmth but little privacy, while the city quiets not because peace has been achieved, but because exhaustion has done its work. Tomorrow will begin the same way, with light entering courtyards, tools returning to hands, food being prepared carefully from limited stores, and labor resuming without ceremony. Because routine is not broken unless forced, and change arrives only through disruption rather than intention. This is not a world waiting for greatness, discovery, or awakening, but a world focused on endurance, where meaning comes not from singular moments, but from the successful repetition of ordinary days, and where survival itself becomes the silent achievement that defines a life. And so the story ends not with resolution, but with continuation, as ancient Greece settles into another night, unaware of how it will later be remembered, and unconcerned with that memory, because for those living within it, the only task that matters is simple, constant, and enough: to rise again, to work again, and to keep life moving quietly forward, one familiar day at a time.